Thank you, Mr Acting Deputy President. I rise to speak on the Social Services Legislation Amendment Cashless Debit Card Bill 2017, and I do so, Mr Acting Deputy President, with great frustration. Let me say from the outset that I will not be supporting the expansion of these cards, and in turn I will not be supporting this bill. I will certainly not subject further people to what I believe is an experiment that doesn't address the core issues faced by regional and rural people and their communities. Throughout the committee process examining this bill, which I was a part of, it became clear that there has been insufficient consultation with the communities subjected to the expansion, namely Bundaberg in Queensland and the Goldfields in Western Australia. Witnesses at the Kalgoorlie hearing in particular expressed serious dissatisfaction, Mr Acting Deputy President, with the consultation process that was undertaken prior to the announcement of the Goldfields trial site, describing it as very lacklustre. Senators at the hearing heard that the consultation process in the Goldfields was not broad enough and that participants often felt disempowered by the discussions. I quote some of the phrases that the committee heard from people in the communities to be targeted by these trials, including in Bundaberg in Queensland and also the Goldfields region of Western Australia. And I quote, "My presence at that meeting was irrelevant. They don't listen. They've got their minds made up. It fell on deaf ears. They'd made a decision anyway. All we were doing was rubber stamping." End of quote. Other words used to describe the consultation process included selective, secretive and behind closed doors. This is deeply troubling language of exclusion, and it is a hallmark of this government. Further, the bill provides absolutely no guidance as to how consent is to be obtained in the proposed new trial sites. So how did we get here? The Cashless Debit Card, CDC, trial in the East Kimberley in Western Australia and Ceduna in South Australia began by quarantining 80% of state benefits received by all working-age people 15 to 64 years of age. This compulsory trial included people receiving disability, parenting, carers, unemployed and youth allowance payments. The Centre for Aboriginal Economic Policy Research, based out of ANU, detailed some of the shocking ramifications for local communities as a result of this policy. In their recent working paper entitled The Cashless Debit Card Trial in the East Kimberley, CAPA noted that, although Australian government communications state that the CDC is for both Indigenous and non-Indigenous welfare recipients, both the trial sites targeted Indigenous people disproportionately. Specifically, 75% of people in the Ceduna trial and 82% in the East Kimberley trial are Indigenous. And the origins of this policy were a key recommendation in a review by mining billionaire Andrew Forrest, which examined Indigenous employment and training. So let's have a look at the criticism of Labor's position. And I note there has been criticism of Labor's position in relation to this particular policy, and that if Labor really cared, we'd offer our unwavering support. Some have the view that this card will reduce alcohol-fuelled violence, drug use and gambling in our regional and remote communities. We've heard it spoken many times in this debate. However, the evidence I have heard, both in committee hearings and on the ground in the Northern Territory and beyond, has been different. Like many dramatic changes to income management schemes, the assumption that people subject to the policy are directly engaged in the overconsumption of alcohol and illegal drugs is unfair and should not be the guiding reason to implement such a measure. We have never been opposed to this policy in principle. Targeted welfare is one aspect that makes Australia's social safety net so strong. However, I am vehemently opposed to exposing our communities to policies that are not properly consultative or, Mr Acting Deputy President, that they lack the proper evidence and data to show that they are effective. As I mentioned earlier in this debate, this lack of consultation was a constant and re-emerging theme throughout evidence received during the Senate committee process. The cashless debit card has so far delivered inconsistent results. Before expanding this program, we need to make sure it's producing the right results on the people it's intended for. Now, take, for example, a witness in the Kimberley region. Superintendent Adams of the Kimberley Police District told the Senate inquiry that in the 12 months to June 30, 2016, there were 319 domestic assaults in Kununurra, but in the 12 months to June 30, 2017, and the time of the trial, this figure had increased to 508. Carla Walquist of The Guardian published a damning piece following a symposium on the policy at Melbourne University. And in her piece, she detailed the harrowing experience of a domestic violence survivor, in which the victim, who was from Ceduna, expressed the view that the cashless welfare card would have stopped her from being able to escape a violent and oppressive marriage. Perhaps most significantly, Dr Janet Hunt from ANU states, the expansion of CDC is based on the results of AREMA's final evaluation report, which shows a questionable effect of the trial and of which concerns have been raised about its methodology. And I quote, "Just before the report was released, the minister issued a press release which hailed the success of the trial without qualification. But once the evaluation report was public, it was clear that the report's authors had in fact qualified their positive findings with many caveats which have been completely ignored by the minister in his public statements about the evaluation." End of quote. Mr Acting Deputy President, there were major issues around the baseline evaluation assessment prior to the establishment of the CDCT. There was no survey of potential CDCT participants to assess their usage of alcohol and drugs or the extent of their gambling. This did not occur until some months after participants had been on the card. There was never, in the later analysis, a breakdown of these income support payments, ISP categories, among people interviewed. So one cannot tell, Mr Acting Deputy President, whether the card is good for some groups of ISP recipients and not for others. And despite these circumstances, Labor supported the establishment of the trial in East Kimberley and Ceduna on the basis that these communities wanted to trial the card. In the interest of supporting the communities who wanted to trial the card and for there to be a thorough and proper examination of the outcomes of this policy, I do not support cancelling the framework. I do, however, strongly oppose the expansion of this policy to additional communities until we can examine the proper outcomes of the trials in these regions, which at this point appear to be of little benefit to the people on the ground. There are certainly issues with other cards, and I refer in particular in the Northern Territory with the Basics card. While many of these income management schemes appear to work well on paper, the mechanics of implementing cashless income management systems in regional and remote communities are not without significant difficulty. And I say this because only recently, when a violent storm on the Tiwi Islands disabled the only communication tower in the community, essentially rendering the Basics card that people there use as useless. People were unable to purchase food, fuel or even power for their homes. And the government's response? And I quote, "People can contact the Department of Human Services Income Management line 1800 132 954 available 24 hours a day, 7 days a week for assistance in accessing income-managed funds." End of quote. Well, Mr Acting Deputy President, you know, that's pretty difficult, considering there's no working phone to call the Department of Human Services. Similarities here with other programs. This approach to income management and the implementation of the cashless cards on the presumption that it will reduce some of the negative aspects of life in regional and remote communities fails to consider more prevalent barriers to meaningful employment, which would ultimately dismiss the need for such policies in the first place. Employment. Yes, we need employment. During the Senate inquiry into the government's disastrous community development program, Labor examined the true foundation as to why people in remote and regional communities struggle to gain and maintain employment. As part of the report that followed the inquiry, the committee made reference to several papers which highlighted barriers to employment for people in regional and remote communities. In a 2010 paper, Mr Acting Deputy President, McRae, Williams and Gerritsen explained the unique economic and employment challenges within remote communities. They went on to say there are limited employment opportunities with a significant gap between the size of the labour force and the number of jobs generated in the local economy as well. Also, inadequate physical infrastructure for many economic development proposals. Similarly, a 2014 study by the Australian Institute of Health and Welfare also found that Indigenous Australians generally experience multiple barriers to economic participation, including lower levels of education, poorer health and more difficulties with English, when we know that in the Northern Territory in particular, we have over 100 Aboriginal languages. That's why we have the Aboriginal Interpreter Services. So we know that English is not the first language for many of our First Nations Australians in the north. High rates of incarceration. Well, we've seen the rates increase at such a rapid rate. In particular, for Indigenous women, the rise in incarceration rates is an absolute disgrace. Inadequate housing. Well, this week we've also seen the federal government renege on the most important area that we clearly need to close the gap, but also for the homeless in this country, and that is the partnerships in housing with each state and territory jurisdiction, the inability of this government to focus on that and see that clearly as major economic drivers in our remote and regional areas of this country. A lack of access to social networks that may help to facilitate employment. All of these things are so critical. Practical challenges such as needing to travel to buy groceries and attend medical appointments, as these services are either too expensive or simply not available in remote communities. Again, I can give you numerous examples in the remote regions of the Northern Territory where food prices are still questionable, too high, when there is cut-off in terms of roads and access because of the wet season, in particular at this time of year. The only opportunity that people have to get out of their communities is by air. Those air flights, charter flights, cost extremely significant amounts. I get phone calls from different residents around different parts of the north, from family members who tell me the problems they're having trying to get from Doomadgee back to Borroloola and then over to Katherine, where they need to be able to seek medical assistance or to be able to fly on to Darwin. This is the reality of life in the bush and the regions for First Nations Australians. This is what they have to endure. This is the life people live. Let's not make it harder by cutting their access to what little funds that they have. In light of these issues, particularly the lack of consideration from the government to the root causes of so many problems prevalent in regional and remote communities, I cannot support this bill, which ultimately seeks to expand the current program to additional regional and remote communities.